rule, rather quickly the externalities of this policy were shown up, which is very interesting that it recurred back and had political backlash very quickly. But I think it seemed to me that we as a planning field had to think, well, what were the alternatives? So I think it's in that context, growing a more participative democratic culture in a country which had been not very well developing such a culture was a very important motivation for people like me and other people in their own, all your diverse political cultures in different countries will perhaps have seen some potential for that as well. So we're dealing with something, a kind of a set of ideas which have a very strong normative concern, a more participative democratic culture which is also linked to something which people might call a more progressive agenda. And there are all these different words we're using. So I think in the previous slide, if I just pick up, we're talking about something which is very broad actually, because it's linking to what are we thinking about how state, society, economy relates. When you start thinking about democracy, you have to be thinking about those relationships. It's also about our interactions between humans and the environment, and that links back to the land resources question. So we've got all these words flying about, and in Julianalaan and David Brewer's new book, 2010, which is Planning with Complexity, they emphasise collaborative rationality, is the term that they've used. But sometimes these words are used interchangeably, sometimes people try to divide them up and say this is about this is about that. But I don't think one can take any of these words as having a stable meaning. You have to think, what is this person using this concept for in this context? So what I'll do in a little bit is to try to get a bit more of a more precise meaning as a result of context. Well, I think for many people, the collaborative notion, and for Julianalaan, for example, in a definition I'll use in a minute, for her and other people like Jeff Bishop writing in the UK, and possibly Larry Susskind with his book called Consensus Building Practices, very much emphasising this importance of face-to-face communication. Particularly, there's a lot of practice developed around collaboratively designing neighbourhoods, public gardens, all sorts of things where people can get together and talk about something, the ideas they have for making a concrete improvement somewhere. Even to develop quite large settlements will be working in this collaborative way, where people are all wandering around having a bit of a think about their city and what they want to do. And it's also, even in the UK, for example, both of these examples are from activities going on in the UK, because I can easily access them. But somebody like Jeff Bishop, who has been working for very many years in parallel with if I've been doing the academic side, he's been doing the practice side. And I think he just has a paper in your Planning Research and Practice, which TU Delft is now publishing, I think, that he's talking about the work that he's done. And he says, hey, there's an awful lot of this going on. Meanwhile, some of the academic literature is telling you, oh, it's impossible to do. So this is a bit of a contradiction. On the one hand, people say it doesn't happen. On the other hand, saying, well, I've been doing it for years and it does happen. And I think it's probably fair to say that doing things collaboratively is now part of the normal talk of our government officers. So it's sort of come in somehow or other. Now, looking at definitions, these are far too long a piece of text, but I actually went on to, I quite often go onto Google or Wikipedia to see what people are saying about something or other, and Wikipedia is really interesting because sometimes it's all clear and sometimes it's not. Well, I don't know if anybody's been on Wikipedia to look at collaborative planning, but it's got a big health warning which says, this page needs tidying up. We don't really think it's authoritative. So if any of you want to tidy it up, please go ahead and do that. So I thought to myself, well, I'd better write down something about what definition I could actually come to. And I thought it centres on, and I put here place governance. just to remind us as to bring us down to place. But it's got something about it working interactively. And I think what is interactive, what is the meaning of interactively, it's back to that something to do with the face-to-face, but you don't always have to be face-to-face to be interacting. It's focusing on the relations, as opposed to sitting there analytically and doing analyses as to what might be the key parameters and therefore what should be the actions, and here you are with the answer. You're working continuously interactively, which means you're working through all kinds of different relations, which takes you to ideas about the kind of networks of the relations, the arenas in which you're working. With stakeholders, there's a lot of puzzle about the role of stakeholders. Some people think that that's the word stakeholders it sees as a sign of a neoliberal worm creeping through our democracy. But actually, it's a very useful word. I picked it up from John Bryce, who's in the management field. And I said to him, tell me your meaning of stakeholder at some time or other. And he said, I mean somebody who has a stake in a piece of ground. And I think that's very helpful for us. A place, stake in a place, stake in the land, stake in issues about environmental resource management. And if we think about it in that way, we can put the relations which then attach to the way we put the stake in the ground. So for me, that's why I like the word stakeholder. So a stakeholder concerned with place development problems and futures, and then now comes the normative bit, which then is working interactively and bringing in, and this is the ethical side of it, multiple perspectives, not just one, which is that, okay, so we're not just interested in the economic side. And engaging in governance work which promotes inclusivity to these multiple perspectives. And also, back to John Friedman, knowledge. Planning is knowledge translated into action. So, richly informed. The thing which we've added to that, which is so important these days, is being informed. That knowledge is not just systematic scientific knowledge. All the types of knowledge which we now know is available to us, experiential knowledge, intuitive knowledge, etc. So bringing all of that into the arena. Now, interestingly, Julianalaan, in their reasonable mind, thought, well, how is she? We're very good friends, but we don't always agree. This is often the case with people who've been working together for a long time. For her, she wants to keep it all defined to that face-to-face interaction, and her research has been on those collaboratives, those kind of working for context, not so much dealing with, say, urban design or public gardens, but groups of people who get together to try to sort water management problems, or they're trying to deal with transport problems. So those are the ones she's been actually looking at, and she's been very much interested in the learning that takes place in that. But already you can see that, that my definition, I'm taking it more broadly, because there are many, in a much more complexity of the relationships that are brought together when one starts thinking about producing a spatial strategy for a neighbourhood, or thinking about what should be a city, what's key strategic principles for a city plan. For me, it's a larger arena, or set in complexity of arenas that I'm thinking about. So that's getting a little bit into the meaning, and we've got all the critics, which I expect you were. I sometimes wonder how much of all this is perhaps segmented into those people doing master's programs here, whether you're having to pick up all this discussion, but also maybe people doing PhDs in this kind of area we've probably touched on it, saying, well, okay, there's all this focus on process, not on substance. Somebody was saying yesterday the importance of linking the two together. It neglects power, and yet, for me, interactively, it's all about manipulating, mobilising different power resources and changing power dynamics. And I don't think that any kind of planning work can avoid being involved in that mobilisation of power. You're bringing knowledge in.